As most of us are probably aware, the current head of state and the King of the United Kingdom is Charles III. In honor of his upcoming coronation, I decided to take a look back on the disastrous reign of England's first Charles. One can only hope that Charles III does not meet a similar fate. Charles Stuart was born on the 19th of November 1600, the second son and the third child of his father, James VI of Scotland. However, by the time he was 3, his father had become the King of England, Scotland and Ireland, following the death of Elizabeth I in 1603. Charles had very little preparation to become the king. After all, he was the second son, which meant his older brother Henry received most of the attention when it came to preparation to rule the country. Henry would die in 1612 of typhoid, leaving a 12-year-old Charles next in line to the English throne. Charles was a timid and quiet man. Unlike his father, he was not one for hefty debates, instead tending to seek asylum in the care of his closest advisers, most notably George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, who from now on we'll just refer to as Buckingham. Charles was a deeply religious man, and although many suspicions arose about his true loyalties, he was a firm Protestant his whole life. He was also a firm believer in the divine right of kings, and was determined to rule at his own accord. He often questioned the role of Parliament, and wished to rule without such an instrument, a belief which would ultimately lead to his demise. In part 1 of the series, we'll look at the years 1625 till 1629, when he ruled alongside Parliament. The second video will look at the personal rule from 1629 until 1640, and the third and final video will look at the year 1640 till his death in 1649. Charles became King of England, Scotland and Ireland on the 27th of March 1625, following the death of his father. However, Charles and Buckingham had been essentially leading the country since the year prior due to his father's poor health. His marriage to the French Catholic Henrietta Maria swiftly followed in May over proxy. Charles's main goal at the time of coming to power was to restore his brother-in-law, Fredrick of the Palatinate, in his struggles against the Habsburgs. In Charles's first sum in Parliament, he was granted 2 subsidies worth £140,000, approximately 140 million in today's money. This was not an adequate amount of money to effectively wage a war. However, it was justified by Parliament as England had not yet declared war on Spain. Parliament had also only decided to allow the collection of tonnage and poundage for 1 year. Charles had no other option but to levy a forced loan on his richer subjects worth 2 subsidies. Altogether, around £500,000 was spent on preparation for the navy, which would prove disastrous. In October of the same year, a fleet set sail for the Spanish port town of Cadiz. With a lack of basic equipment and materials such as water, the army found itself stranded in Spain, accompanied by a farm full of barrels of wine. Predictably, many soldiers got drunk and the attack was abandoned. Achieving nothing but humiliation, the fleet turned back to England. As Lord Admiral, Buckingham took much of the blame. In February 1626, Charles called another Parliament, yet with several key figures such as Thomas Wentworth and Edward Coke removed, in order to ensure a more successful session. This did quite the opposite, as many MPs grew dissatisfied with Charles. No subsidies were passed, and nothing other than a tax on Buckingham came of this. With no other way of raising finance, Charles turned to yet another forced loan. However, this one was worth 5 subsidies and aimed at all subsidy payers. By 1627, over £260,000 had been raised, saving Charles from immediate bankruptcy. This put a strain on relations between Charles and Parliament, as a tax had been raised without parliamentary consent. February also saw the York House Conference, a theological debate between Arminianism and Calvinism, led by Buckingham. Arminianism was a new branch of Protestantism, which wished to worship the beauty and holiness. It was seen as Catholic-esque and untrusted in England. Much of Parliament were Calvinists, which was seen as more in line with Protestant thinking. Charles himself was Arminian, and he would also defend the few Arminian MPs. For example, the MP Sibthorpe was attacked for favouring the forced loans and impeached, yet Charles pardoned him. Over the years, relations with France had rapidly deteriorated. In 1625, the French used loaned English ships to defeat Protestant forces, which greatly angered many in England. In June 1627, Buckingham led an expedition to the French island of Ré, guarding the gateway to La Rochelle. The expedition took a turn for the worse when the lack of equipment, financial backing, and reinforcements became evident. Worst of all, the scaling ladders which had been planned to bring troops over the fortress walls were too short, effectively giving the English no hope of victory. Yet again, Buckingham was forced to make an embarrassing retreat back to England. 1627 is also famous for the Five Knights case. Charles's forced loans in England proved wildly unpopular. Many believed it was a violation of the fundamental right of taxation by Parliament. 76 members of the gentry were imprisoned for refusing to pay the loan. When the Chief Justice of the King's Bench, Sir Ranulph Crewe, pronounced the loans to be illegal, he was dismissed. Five Knights then challenged for habeas corpus, a fundamental right in English law where a prisoner must be released within 24 hours if no cause for imprisonment was found. It was argued that they had been imprisoned by special command of our Lord the King. Not only was Charles taxing without consent, but now imprisoning at his own desire. In the spring of 1628, yet another raid to La Rochelle was undertaken. Under the Earl of Denbigh, it saw a greater failure than the year prior. Meanwhile, in England, MPs and Charles knew that for an effective parliament, concessions must be made. The Commons offered the king 5 subsidies and finally granted him tonnage and poundage. This was an attempt to show their loyalty, and in return, the Petition of Right was drawn up in June. The document asked for an end to non-parliamentary taxation, imprisonment without cause, billeting, and martial law. Charles, however, viewed it as an attack on his liberties. Although he did accept the petition, he did so with reluctance. The normal way for a monarch to show acceptance to a bill was to say,
Soit droit faire comme il est desire.
Let it be done as desired. Charles initially gave a vague answer in English, though. The king willeth that right be done according to the laws and custom of the realm. In August, in the city of Portsmouth, Buckingham met his end at the hands of John Felton, a former soldier who had grown to hate Buckingham. While Charles was saddened at the passing of his close friend, many in England celebrated his death. This would deeply traumatize Charles, and he began to grow distant to his people. In January, another parliamentary session had begun. It was dominated by 2 issues, Arminianism and tonnage and poundage. This again created friction between Charles and Parliament, some even viewing him as a Catholic sympathizer. MPs were uneasy at the pace that Arminianism was increasing, and therefore it was decided that religion would take precedence. Yet another source of tension came from the fact that the Petition of Right had been printed with Charles's original unclear answer. Parliament was obviously not going to grant Charles customs without major concessions. In March, while the Speaker of the Parliament was being held down, John Eliot read 3 resolutions, condemning anyone who promoted innovation in religion, popery, or Arminianism, counselled the collection of tonnage and poundage, and voluntarily paid the duties. With the session clearly not heading in the correct direction, Charles dissolved Parliament shortly after the 3 resolutions. This would mark the beginning of his 11-year personal rule. Charles did not intend to rule with Parliament in the future. However, his own actions are what led to its recall 11 years later, and eventually his end.